Hey everybody, my name is Ben Teese. I work for Shine Technologies, and I'm going to give you a little introduction to the topic of Angular and accessibility. Accessibility is an enormous field in itself, but it can be a little bit daunting to get started. A little while ago I had to work on an app for the first time, making it accessible. I just wanted to kind of share a few of the things that I learned during that journey. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say, but when I first was assigned to make an app accessible, I felt a bit like this. I was frankly a little bit annoyed and was wondering whether I was being punished for something. Accessibility certainly wasn't hugely on my radar. I didn't really know anything about it. However, I eventually sort of made some tentative steps to get started, and then sure enough found myself getting right into it and learning all sorts of new and interesting things, until finally I was in a situation where not only was the app now on path to being accessible, but it was also code-wise in better shape than it had been before. So in this talk I'm going to kind of start by introducing what I see as kind of the two pillars of accessibility. The first is ARIA, which I'll do a basic introduction to. That's kind of what screen readers use to make sense of web applications. And then the second part of it is keyboard navigation, because not all of our users have the luxury of being able to use a mouse or a trackpad. And then finally I'm going to put it all together and present a little bit more sophisticated custom component that's incorporating elements of both ARIA and keyboard navigation. And of course I'm going to be talking about this in the context of what Angular can also do to make it easier for us to make our app accessible. And along the way I'm also going to present some examples of how thinking about accessibility forced me to improve my code. So let's start with ARIA. These days we're building all sorts of amazing, sophisticated, client-side rich applications. They've certainly gone well beyond the humble document-based origins of the web. But whilst our application might look terrific to a regular user in a browser, to someone using a screen reader, it could quite possibly just be a mass of mutating divs that is utterly unintelligible. So to try and help us in this situation, we have what's called ARIA, which stands for the Accessible Rich Internet Application Standard. And it's a whole set of new attributes that you can add to your markup to denote that certain sections of those markup are actually widgets. And to my mind at least, the key word in ARIA is application. It's all about when you are building web applications, as opposed to just document-based stuff where in the past semantic HTML has been sufficient. When you've gone beyond just building documents, which frankly a lot of us have done these days, we've gone beyond that into application territory. That's when ARIA really comes into its own. So let's have a look at a really simple example of ARIA in action. And for this one I'm going to use an icon. Now admittedly this is a very big icon, I've blown it right up in the browser, but it is still just an icon. I don't know about you, but I hardly really put any JPEGs or even PNGs in my apps anymore. There might be just a handful. All of the other images in the app are icons. There's a couple of ways we can do icons. We can use SVGs or icon fonts. I'm just going to go with icon font. I'm a little bit more old school on that front, just kind of as a lowest common denominator thing. And the way in which we might typically implement an icon is just to have some sort of empty span tag, and it will have a class. In this case I'm just going to set the class to be icon star. We want to make it that this icon actually does something when it's clicked, so we're also going to add an ng click to it. The CSS for something like this is usually along the lines of specifying a font family. Then we'll sort of have this little hack in here to set some content on a little a pseudo tag before our markup. The content will just be set to some obscure character code corresponding to our icon. And in the best case, a screen reader will ignore this character code. In the worst case, it will read it out and it will just be garbage. So the end result is that for someone who's vision impaired, this icon won't mean much at all. They won't know what to make of it. It'll just be, from their perspective, an empty span. Fortunately, ARIA comes to the rescue and helps us make our icon accessible, and it does this by giving us additional attributes we can add. So the first one I'm going to add is the role attribute, and that really just specifies what sort of widget this is. In this case, I'm just going to say that it's a button. The second attribute I'm going to add is ARIA label, and that's just some plain text that a screen reader will read out when it is paying attention to this icon or reading over this icon. However, a browser will just completely ignore this value. So let's take it for a little spin in the browser. Now, to demonstrate this, I'm going to use the OS X voiceover capability, which is a screen reader built right into OS X for free. It's a great way to get started with accessibility and testing your accessible site to see how it appears to a screen reader. VoiceOver will put a little black box around what it's currently looking at. So at the moment you'll see a little black box up in the hamburger menu in the top right hand corner of the screen. VoiceOver also gives us the option just down at the bottom of the screen. It can put in some high contrast text that will just be exactly what it's reading out over the speaker as well. But what we want to pay attention to here is what's actually coming over the system audio. So I'm going to start playing this.
Chrome button.
So it reads out that it was on a Chrome button.
Leaving toolbar. HTML content.
So with the keyboard I navigated it forward.
Do stuff button.
Then navigated onto the do stuff button and it read that out.
Leaving HTML content. Chrome button.
I got VoiceOver to navigate back to the button, the Chrome button.
Leaving toolbar. HTML content.
Then I brought it back forward into the HTML page.
Do stuff button.
And finally it's going to read out that we have the do stuff button. So that's a really quick and easy example of how we've been able to take something that was entirely visual, in this case a star icon, and help it make sense to a screen reader by giving it a description and or some text description and a role, and a widget role. We'll get back a little bit more into ARIA later, but before we do that, I just want to have a quick dive into the second sort of pillar of accessibility, and that is keyboard navigation, because as I mentioned, not everybody has the luxury of being able to use a trackpad or a mouse to navigate your web application. And this is probably a good example here of keyboard navigation in action. So I've just got like a little, this is a fragment of an HTML page. I've just got some code here for accepting an account number, entering a postcode. Then we've got this kind of custom checkbox widget. I can navigate through it using keyboard. You can see the focus shifting, and then finally I've got a nice button down there at the bottom. So HTML will give us, or a browser will give us some basic keyboard navigation for simple form elements, but it does get a little bit more problematic when we start looking at custom widgets and buttons. So this is probably an opportune time to introduce the ngAria module, which gives us a lot of assistance getting started with ARIA in an accessible Angular application. Funnily enough, what I'm about to talk about that ngAria gives us isn't actually, strictly speaking, probably ARIA related, because it's keyboard navigation. You'll see that in a second. So if we go back to our icon example, and you'll recall that the markup, the template markup looked a little bit like this, although I have taken out the role attribute, and you'll see shortly why I've been able to do that. When it comes to understanding what ngAria does for us, I think it's beneficial to contrast the template with what actually appears in the DOM after ngAria has done its work. So by default, without ngAria enabled, what appears in the DOM pretty much matches what was in the template. However, interesting things when we enable the ngAria module. And enabling it really is just as simple as making it a module dependency of our application, or of some module within our application. As soon as we do that, magic starts to happen. Specifically, ngAria goes through our app and looks for everything that's got an ng click on it. In this case, we've got our star icon, and it will automatically add a role button by default to our DOM, and it will also automatically add a tab index of 0, which means that our button becomes keyboard navigable. And it does all of this for us for free. So that's pretty awesome. An interesting side effect, however, that I found of all of this is that it immediately flags when you've got some bad markup in your application, or you perhaps haven't thought very clearly. You've got bugs basically in your application. You mightn't have thought clearly about how to write clean markup. And here's an example originally taken from something I saw in the real world. Consider a simple list with one item in it, and we're going to make it, here's the markup for the list, we're going to make it that when you click a span inside the list item, it does some stuff, it performs some action. However, what someone has done later on is they've wanted to do some sort of event tracking on this app, and someone's come along later on and they've made it that if the list item gets clicked, then some tracking occurs. Now, there's a couple of problems with this. Firstly, if we've got ngAria enabled, because there are ng clicks on both elements, both of them become keyboard navigable, and that isn't really desirable from a usability perspective for any user. So if I was to do some navigation through the app, the list item is navigatable and the span's navigatable. Even worse, if I click the span, both event handlers get tripped off, but I just click the list item, only the tracking event handler gets tipped off. So in this case, we've got a scenario where depending upon where the user clicks, different things can happen. And thus you become dependent on, in real life usage, people have made it that this mightn't have been immediately apparent because the list item was styled to be almost entirely overlaid by the span. But for those areas where it wasn't overlaid, this incorrect tracking would happen, and you're kind of relying on a styling issue to stop this behavioral problem. So the first instinct to try and solve something like that might be to have two ng clicks on the span element, but that just doesn't work, mostly because Angular will just ignore the second ng click, which is quite possibly why we would have put an ng click on the list item instead. A better thing to do is probably what we should have done all along, and that is shift as much logic as possible out of the template and into the controller. So in this case, we might just make a new method on a controller called do some tracking and stuff, and we'll make it that both the tracking and actually doing of stuff happens inside that controller method. So having done that, we're going to go back to our example. Because we've only got one ng click, only the span is now keyboard navigable, which is probably preferable from a usability perspective. Even better if we click it, our tracking and stuff still happens, but if we click the list item on its own, then nothing at all happens, which all round is a better result from both a markup and code perspective and even from a general usability perspective. Okay, so let's move on to a more sophisticated example. I've given you a quick introduction to ARIA. I've done some basics of keyboard navigation and what ngAria can do to help you with that. Let's talk about a more sophisticated real-world component. And I think a good example is a custom checkbox, because I don't know about you, but it's been a long time since any of my clients have wanted to use a bog standard HTML checkbox. They all want their checkboxes to have a special look and feel just for them. So here's an example of a custom checkbox in action. You saw it earlier. We could keyboard navigate to it and activate it also with the keyboard, which is kind of cool. And it's got some text on it, and we can still navigate to hyperlinks within that text, but overall we want this thing to be keyboard controllable and also make sense to a screen reader. So how do we go about doing that? Well, let's look at some basic markup for starters, maybe in the non-accessible case. The way in which you would implement a custom checkbox like this might be to have a top-level div for the checkbox, and it's got two parts: an image, which is what actually displays the checkbox, and then the text afterwards. We're going to make it that our image is clickable, and when it's clicked, it toggles a variable in the scope, a Boolean variable in the scope, and that Boolean variable is also used to dictate which icon is being displayed. So that's all well and good, but pretty much, again, it's just a blizzard of divs to a screen reader. So what can we do to make it accessible? Well, we can start to bring in some of these ARIA attributes again. First, we're going to use a role, this time of checkbox. Secondly, we're going to bring in an ARIA attribute called ARIA checked, which is used with checkboxes. We can set it to true or false, which means we can just bind it directly to an expression that is the isChecked variable on the scope. And it will just automatically change and be set correctly. Even better though, ngAria can do some more legwork for us. It can in fact use ngModel to automatically add ARIA attributes. So if we set ngModel to isChecked on our checkbox div, ngAria will detect that and it will add some new things to the DOM for us. Let's have a look. Firstly, it'll add some new classes. Now, with or without ngAria, it will do this, so we don't have to worry too much about those. Those are kind of used for display purposes all around. However, interestingly, it will automatically add a tab index of 0 just by virtue of this thing having an ngModel on it. So it becomes keyboard navigable. It also detects that it's got a role of checkbox and therefore automatically starts setting ARIA checked to be the value of the ngModel, which is pretty awesome. And interestingly, it even adds another attribute to flag whether this ngModel is valid or not. In this particular case, I'm not going to pay much attention to it, but it's kind of cool that it does that for you automatically and enables you to make your form and model validation accessible as well down the track. That said, there is one little problem again that's come about, and this points to some bad markup. Can you see what it is? We've got our ngModel being set here on the top level div, but we still have an ngClick here inside the checkbox image. Thinking about what ngAria does, it makes the tab index, it adds tab indexes to both. So if we look at the DOM, we'll see that it's added a tab index of 0 here at the top level div, but it's also automatically added a role of button and a tab index of 0 on the checkbox image. So we've got a checkbox that contains a button, which is a little bit confusing, and both the checkbox and the image inside of it are keyboard navigable. And what that means is that if we were to try and navigate through it with a keyboard, the entire checkbox can get focus, but also the image itself gets focus. And in fact, the image itself has to have focus in order to be toggleable. And if you look at the way that just default checkboxes work in HTML, what we're doing here is kind of bad because checkboxes, the default checkbox implementation inside a browser, if you click the text, then the checkbox can be activated as well. Whereas here, only the actual checkbox image itself can be activated. So this is not just a bit of an accessibility fail from a keyboard navigation perspective, but it's also a bit of a drag for any user. Fortunately, fixing this is pretty straightforward. All that we need to do is move the ngClick up from the checkbox image div into the checkbox div. And that means that the whole thing becomes clickable, it becomes keyboard navigable on its own, and therefore it becomes much more consistent with the way that checkboxes are supposed to work. So I can give the whole thing focus and activate it from the keyboard, just like that. And I can still navigate to the any hyperlinks or anchor tags inside the text, but that's kind of independent from actually activating or navigating the checkbox. And finally, we'll take it for a spin with a screen reader just to see how the screen reader interprets these ARIA roles and attributes that we've added. So the screen reader is starting with focus on the postcode field, and I'm just going to advance it forward to the checkbox and then activate the checkbox and see what the screen reader does. Here we go.
I have read and agreed to the terms of use. Unchecked. Checkbox. Checked. I have read and agreed to
So
the
I
terms
just
of use.
activated
Checkbox.
the checkbox.
Unchecked. I have read and agreed to the terms of use. Checkbox.
And then I deactivated it.
Checked. I have read and agreed to the terms of use. Checkbox.
Then I activated it again.
Unchecked. I have read and agreed to the terms of use. Checkbox.
So that's pretty cool. We just took a widget and were able to make it both keyboard navigable and comprehensible to a screen reader, and thus someone who, for example, is vision impaired. In this talk, we've just done a quick introduction to ARIA overall. ARIA is admittedly an enormous topic. There are hundreds of attributes available. I encourage you to take a look at the spec to start to get a feel for how you navigate around them all. We've also taken a look at keyboard navigability and in particular the awesome things that ngAria can do to give you keyboard navigation pretty much out of the box just by enabling it or bringing it in as a module to your app. And then finally we have taken a look at a more sophisticated custom component, in this case a checkbox. We were able to make it accessible and make sense to a screen reader and also get the keyboard navigation working on it. And along the way through all of this, I think you'll agree that we've seen how thinking about accessibility and enabling ngAria has shown up a couple of flaws in the way in which we had structured our markup. And that led to even an improved user experience for all users and even better and cleaner markup. So thanks very much for listening.